Okay, I think we're gonna get started. Great, well, thanks everyone so much for being here and braving the weird rain-wind mix. Very appreciated. My name is Grace Western, she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-head of advocacy at the Autonomy Institute, the organization behind the Forum 2029 series. So I'll be chairing tonight's event, making sense of the new right. So a very light and easy topic for us tonight. So for those who don't know, the Autonomy Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research organization. We specialize in tackling crucial issues around work, welfare, climate, and democracy, and in creating data-driven tools and research. And while we're based in the United Kingdom, we do offer an international team and outlook, working regularly with partners from around the world, like one of our wonderful panelists today, Lee Andersson, all the way from Finland. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. We will be recording tonight's session, so when we get to the Q&A, if you do ask a question, you will be recorded. Hope that works, thanks. Also, the bathrooms are to my left here / your right with the very clear signs, so if you need that. And we also just want to say a big shout out to our sponsors, the RLS Foundation and the Emil Milburn Trust. Thank you so much. And then Annie from Oxford House, who makes everything possible and for hosting us. It's very appreciated. And also Tom on the recording. Thank you so much. So for tonight's session, we'll hear from three wonderful panelists: Anki Deo from Hope Not Hate, Alan Finlayson from the University of East Anglia, and member of European Parliament, Lee Andersson. For awareness, we'll start with some remarks from each panelist, have a question or two from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So we'll have at least 30 minutes for Q&A, because I'm sure there will be many questions. So just a quick light background on what Forum 2029 is, and then we'll jump into tonight's conversation. So Forum 2029 series are events bringing together leading voices from across the center and left-wing spectrum to shape a bold but coherent policy platform for the UK's future. Last year, we held 7 events on a range of policy areas featuring a variety of speakers, some of whom are in this room. And our panels so far this year have looked at policies to kind of help guarantee the essentials in volatile times, as well as debrief on the local and devolved elections. Thank you to Alan, who was here a few weeks ago doing that with us. So the wider idea for this year's series is to dive a bit deeper into specific themes we think are pressing for progressives in this country. I think we all understand that politics in this country are accelerating quickly, and when we started Forum 2029 last year, Zach Polanski had just announced that he was running to be leader of the Green Party, and then we had him speak at the launch of this series the next day. So now we know the Green Party are neck and neck with Labour in the polls, have had surging membership, so it's really changing the composition of progressive forces in this country entirely. So as you know, for this panel, we'll be focusing on the rise of the far right. Reform UK's rapid rise has reshaped the political landscape ahead of the 2029 general election. Understanding what drives this movement, how it operates, and what it wants from the next election is no longer optional for anyone serious about progressive politics. At Autonomy, we have our Interlink project, which aims to convene campaigners and experts around understanding the new radical right. It will also be launching its own investigations and cooperating with actors trying to counter the radical right, both in the UK and worldwide. And we see this conversation today as a part of that initiative. If you're curious to hear more, Will will happily speak to you after the event. So this Forum 2029 event will focus on the contemporary British New Right, its ideological roots, its electoral strategy, and the social conditions it is exploiting. Who is voting for reform and the further right, and why? How is the new right likely to campaign in 2029, and what vulnerabilities will it target? How does it relate to street movements on its rightward flank? And what does a credible progressive response actually look like? So that's enough for me. So to start us off, we'll hear from Anki Deo, who leads on insights on the policy team at Hope Not Hate, the UK's biggest anti-fascism organization. Her work covers democracy and politics, young people and migration, and includes public attitudes, research, sector outreach, and policy development. And recent research reports Anki has written for Hope Not Hate include focusing on reform voters and community resiliency, things we need. So can you give us a state of play, Anki, on the far right and the work that you're doing as a result?
Yep, sure. I mean, I think it's actually worth starting, well, when I started at Hope Not Hate 2 years ago, obviously convenient that that's when I start from, but I think it's just worth thinking back to February 2023. If any of you remember the scenes outside the Sweets Hotel in Kirby, in Knowsley near Liverpool, and that kind of feeling that this was an unprecedented occurrence of street violence, and this idea that actually the political far right was firmly on the fringes, but the organised far right on streets were becoming a bit more organised, a bit more active. And then if you fast forward a little bit to the summer of 2024, we had two key events. Of course, the general election that has delivered us the Labour majority that we see now, but also only a few weeks later, the racist rioting. Better? Aha, yes, I can hear that's better, sorry. So we had the general election results and then the riots in such quick succession. And I don't think either of those things are really coincidence, not to sound too conspiratorial, but, you know, both of these things, the rise of reform in the polls, but also the riots breaking out weeks later, I think are expressions of much deeper seated political dissatisfaction, but also the mainstreaming of far right thinking. And, you know, we go right to the current moment, what we're seeing in Southampton last night is just almost like the third punctuation point, with many in between that it's hard to mention, of this idea of a trigger event or some kind of big tension spilling out into public disorder, that rather than focusing at the heart of what's happened, there's always victims, families, the bereaved at the center of this. It becomes about much deeper racism, conspiracy, and kind of a political football. But coming back to this idea of mainstream, I guess it's important to recognise that it's of course the rise of Reform UK and Nigel Farage, it's part of his decades-long political project, but also the importance of Restore and the role that Restore Britain plays in the political sphere as an almost testing ground for reform to see where the line is. Restore occupy this extreme fascist space with, you know, if you think the councillors that Reform have elected are wrong-uns, you should see some of the people who get elected for Restore. There is some real shocking characters there, but it also, in kind of laughing and legitimising that, or, you know, for some people saying, oh, maybe Restore can squeeze the Reform vote in Makerfield, there is this risk that we're actually opening the door to something even uglier and something that almost does benefit Reform in that sense. And also when we think about the wider political environment, this idea that immigration, multiculturalism, and ultimately what can become ethno-nationalist narratives have really dominated the political conversation across the spectrum. So we see, you know, the current government making certain concessions, which, you know, arguably Starmer's now rode back on this idea of island of strangers, but the fact that it was even said is really telling about the political moment that we're in. And then also I wanted to mention, in terms of grassroots tactics making their way into the political sphere, the Shadow Home Secretary filming a kind of migrant hunting, that's what they call themselves, this kind of citizen journalist auditing video, going around looking at Deliveroo drivers outside hotels that he claims as accommodation for people seeking asylum. These are what were previously fringe far-right tactics that draw huge audiences online, but ultimately not that many people were participating in them, being brought onto X, onto the mainstream by an elected politician. And so I suppose what we're seeing right now is a very emboldened far-right who are more powerful than ever. Of course, they also can't stop themselves from squabbling amongst each other and arguing and infighting, and there's an element of that that's important, because they're organised, there's a certain amount of coordination, but there's also a lot of disagreement, and there's lots of cracks in there. And I think we saw this in the Unite the Kingdom rally that took place recently compared to the one that was at the end of 2025. The online engagement and kind of clicks that people like Tommy Robinson are getting isn't always translating to in-person activism. But what we are seeing is mass activism for Reform UK, and people really feeling excited and emboldened by their electoral success at the last two sets of local elections. So I suppose the important thing for us to realise is that we can't be complacent, and there's also lots of work for us to do electorally. So I'll talk a bit more about the kind of elections side of things. My role is in public opinion research and political campaigning, so that's why this is like my thing. We can obviously see a big shift in public attitudes that is a bit similar to what we're seeing with Brexit, this realignment around migration. And whilst there has been progress in terms of softening of attitudes at the kind of individual level, we need to consider the role of polling and public opinion in this debate, because there is this kind of cycle of politicians and also the right more broadly feeding off of irresponsibly worded or very specifically asked polling questions, seeing that as the will of the people or a mandate for them that reconfirms their beliefs. And this cycle continues where we really put migration on this pedestal, when actually when you look at what other issues people care about, they're passionate about public services. They need to know that their jobs are secure and that they'll be safe and happy at work. They're worried about the economy more broadly and what the impact of the war in Iran is going to have on this country. There are other concerns that could be addressed through this lens, but we do kind of remain relatively fixed on immigration. And I think what's interesting about what's happening in Southampton is this kind of spill out of immigration concerns into anti-Muslim hatred, but now the Sikh community has been brought in. People are generally quite bad at distinguishing between those two communities, however frustrating and unusual we might find that fear to be. Unfortunately, that's the truth. And so there is a responsibility to think about how we make these political arguments. But there's also a responsibility for us to really understand who these voters are and who people are who are supporting far-right movements, because if we write everyone off, there's not really going to be that many people left in the country. Reform ceiling might be as high as 1 in 3 people in the UK, right? So it's not in our best interest, nor is it really the morally right thing to do to just give up on people. But I think that we need to draw a line between what is creating a permissive environment for violence and hatred and for people to feel unsafe and unwelcome in their own communities and their own spaces, and what are conversations that we need to be more open to having on fair terms and with the right attitudes. So some of my research into Reform UK voters finds that they're quite an ideologically diverse bunch, and there are groups within them, although immigration is a core concern, who are interested in climate, who are interested in employment rights and really support the Employment Rights Act, even though none of the Reform MPs even bothered to vote or voted against those measures. There are people who are obviously very interested in the NHS and health and social care. There are even people who are really interested in some of the more tricky culture war areas, such as LGBT rights and special educational needs and disabilities. Richard Tice had to row back on his comments about overdiagnosis of special educational needs because it was such a big concern, and so many Reform voters got in touch with him to say that they were disgusted by what he said. So I think it's important for us to know that there are other issues that we can meet people on, and that as a progressive sector, we need to kind of inspire these voters and connect with them on the issues that matter to them, not just the issues that matter to us. I worry a bit about the way that the term progressive activist gets thrown around, because it's sometimes used as this kind of conversation ender of like, well, you know, maybe we're progressive activists, so what do we know about other people? Or that's a progressive activist issue, so there's no point trying to engage people on that. I don't think that's the case. I don't even think that's what More in Common is trying to say. We don't need to shift into the middle ground and forsake any of our ideals, but we do need to bring people towards us using the issues, emotions, topics, and priorities that relate to their ways of being and not our ways of being. And I worry that that's something that we've slightly gotten out of practice. So just the last thing that I'll say, because I think I'm gone on a bit, but just on the road to 2029, we're looking at a really, really complicated political climate. There are now 5, maybe 6 major parties vying for a bunch of different seats. The margins look very low. The predictions are bad because so many people voted tactically in 2024. It's very hard to model what a seat level prediction is going to look like when a lot of the Labour voters aren't actually Labour voters to their core. And it makes it really complicated for those of us who would like to see a Reform government stopped. And we're going to reach a point where we have very difficult questions to ask ourselves about, is it just this party to stop reform, or do I need to look at wider principles and the longer term consequences of these actions? Eventually it might be quite a hard pill for all of us to swallow, but I think the threat of a Reform UK government and what's really at stake is something really important for us to keep in mind.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get onto that piece in the next question as well. So next we'll hear from Alan Finlayson. Alan is a professor of political and social theory at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. And in addition to writing about political theory, UK politics, and digital political culture, he has an overarching interest in rhetoric and speech making as well. And a play inspired by some of his work and his colleagues undertook has invited people from all over the country to make political speeches and is currently on tour. So another exciting event for folks. Our public house by Barney Norris will be at the Marylebone Theatre in London, the 30th of June to July 4th. So yes, welcome back, Alan. Thank you again for joining us again for another Forum 2029 event. Do you mind just speaking into your microphone and I can see how you're sounding?
Sure, how's that?
What do people think? We like my microphone better?
Okay. I mean, I can just
Okay.
see.
I'll pass it down.
Okay.
Okay.
That's okay,
Good.
you can hear me at the back. Yeah?
Anyways, so Alan, you write about reactionary
Yeah.
digital politics. Can you speak more about this, kind of how it's related to the right, how digital culture changes the shape and the form of both political arguments and organizing on the right? And I'm going to pass you this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for plugging the play. Marylebone Theatre, July. What is it? I've forgotten the dates now. Start of July. There you go. Please come. Yes, I can speak about reactionary digital politics and the sort of, as it's a complementary dimension to what Anki's been talking about. Just to kind of start, I have a question. This is partly a question to find out, am I desperately and extremely online and the only one who knows and cares about these things? Has anybody here come across Danny Bones? Yeah, a few of you have, yeah? But most of you have not? Yeah. But I'm not sure if I should say well done to those who haven't or well done to those who have, yeah? So Danny Bones is a rapper, and he's put a number of rap videos. He's got a kind of skinhead look, quite sort of throwback to kind of 70s style, sort of skinhead culture in some way. Raps a bit about poverty, about how the rich are getting richer, and fighting the cops, but also about the loss of England, and there were lots of St. George's flags. So it mixes a kind of English nationalism with a sort of retro flavour of 70s politics and a kind of countercultural, we're against the cops, we're against the rich people and so forth. The most important thing about Danny Bones is that he doesn't exist. He's entirely artificial intelligence. The videos are AI, the raps are AI. But he exists on YouTube as a TikTok poster and as an X poster. So he's not huge, but he's had, not millions and millions of followers, but he has a significant following and is partly paid for by Advance UK, one of the radical right parties. And he has links and posts material by Rupert Lowe from Restore and others. Yeah. A second example, a colleague of mine was researching a series of kind of AI, sort of cartoon-type images that were circulating around on X and related platforms that were all kind of cartoon pictures of young women, often wearing a kind of national flag T-shirt, at some obvious tourist site, the Eiffel Tower, Buckingham Palace, that's sort of surrounded by threatening men, clearly meant to be coded from kind of overseas and so forth. That turned out to be circulated by a couple of influencers based in Qatar, who'd started out doing health and fitness advice videos, but pivoted to AI racism instead. And you may have read the story recently about an influencer who had made around £300,000 so far from running Facebook groups and Facebook pages about anti-immigration politics in the UK, and he was based in Sri Lanka and was Sri Lankan, right? So those kind of three examples show on the one hand how a lot of this is on one of old stuff, old school racism, old school anti-immigration politics, old school style English nationalist politics, but also totally new and totally different. New forms of political expression being distributed in very different and novel sorts of ways, creating different kinds of what we call affective propaganda, different ways of stirring and provoking and appealing to the emotions and defining our politics, and flowing around from sites and sources in very complicated ways, not just confined to the right-wing pub in town over there, but kind of everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. So we have to think about radical right politics at that dimension as well, the electoral and the parties and the groups, but how is it manifesting itself in the kind of cultural, discursive space, a larger kind of ecology within which political ideas are being shaped, expressed, articulated and circulated, sometimes by artificial means, but in ways that are reaching audiences and sometimes appealing to them and radicalizing them. So that's what I call reactionary digital politics, which is not just a way of not saying fascist, because I think some of it is fascist, but it's trying to capture that there's a much broader, rather complicated, slightly, discontinuous, not fully connected and fully unified sort of shape and movement of things out there that I think we can call reactionary digital politics. So what does that mean? So reactionary, firstly, is to define its sort of ideology, because reactionary that's a long-standing political orientation, reacting against progress, reacting to resist and challenge the forces of progress. And so by reactionary, what I mean fundamentally is a politics that is opposed to the politics of equality, okay? Fundamentally to the principle of equality. And that doesn't just mean economic equality, I mean equality in the most fundamental sense. What people demanded in the French Revolution was the equality of the rights of people before the law, as citizens, regardless of their standing, property, whatever it might be, they were equal before the law. And that had its opponents, even then of course, who were called reactionaries. We've got to resist this imposition, this levelling down. This will destroy France, this will destroy European culture. And that politics still exists and opposes fundamentally the claim to equal rights and equal standing that people make. But it folds that into a much larger critique of contemporary politics by saying what's going wrong in the world today is that the liberal state is trying to impose this politics of equality. But because this politics of equality is against nature, because it defies the natural hierarchies and natural differences between us, the liberal state will always have to overreach and try and become ever more grander, trying to make this impossible thing happen. So it will increase its powers, it will become more oppressive, and it will start being oppressive to you, and then it will be the force of inequality, not treating you equally. And that's part of its appeal that often takes the kind of standard, the classic sort of reactionary rhetorical form of, well, it's all gone too far, hasn't it? Yeah? I'm not opposed to people getting this, but it's all gone too far. Look, the police now, etc., etc., right? So that kind of combination, it's gone too far, they're trying to change things that you can't really change, but then appeals to not just hostility to equality, but a sense of you're now being done down because they're trying to put those people over you. And that gives the shape of a kind of political critique, a political claim, and a kind of affective appeal. But part of what makes the right quite powerful, ideologically at least online, is that opposition to equality can come in all kinds of different and in some ways contradictory flavours. But people can be united, despite the fact they might have different, quite varied, specific political demands. There might be people who are most bothered about restoring the natural inequality as they see it between men and women, or between religious groups, or ethnic groups, or civilizational groups, or rich and poor, genetically smarter, etc. So you can bring together your kind of Elon Musk, Silicon Valley kind of tech people who are concerned about money making and competition in the market, with people who are concerned about having authority over their partners, their children, with people who are concerned about being back on top in their town, with people who are concerned about religious disputes, can find themselves having a kind of common ground in a much broader front, a much broader political movement shaped by this commitment to reactionary politics. And they can participate not in a unified movement, but in much broader kind of cultural, political milieu. So that's why it's reactionary. Why is it digital? Well, it's digital because, of course, what we're talking about is a form of politics that is primarily, if not exclusively, propagated online, that is able to profit from the ease with which it is possible to go online and set yourself up as someone who can create content, post ideas, and begin to get paid for it. Digital breaks down the traditional means of idea formation, distribution, which weren't necessarily ideal, in which authorized people in newspapers, journalists, academics, politicians could speak, articulate, deliver ideas. Now lots of people can do it and can make a living unconstrained by a newspaper or a party or a political movement or whatever it might be, and can feel empowered and as participants within that, either as high-level influencers or people who follow influencers, who repost, who make their own supercut fan videos of Elon Musk or Jordan Peterson or whoever it might be. So now you've got people who can feel empowered and participating in politics in a very new kind of way, a different sort of way. and creating kind of arguments and political appeals that are really very different to what we're used to in politics. Because you know this from your, I'm assuming a lot of you are online, if not everybody looking at Danny Bones, the AI rapper. But we have forms of politics that adopt the kind of parasocial styles of other kinds of influencers. Political influence online comes to be a bit like cookery influencers or pet influencers or health influencers. It begins to take the shape of, this one good trick that will help you understand politics. Once you see this, you won't be able to unsee it. Yeah? This will change the way you relate to not just your pet or your health or your makeup routine, but to politics, to society. And that becomes very appealing. It's a kind of commercial appeal, but it's also an ideological political appeal in which entertainment, comedy of sorts, humour, edginess, and a kind of, and sometimes a sort of self-help culture all kind of fuse together. So the part of the political appeal becomes not just this is a kind of a good analysis and will help you make the country better, but you'll feel better. Once you've understood that they're all lying to you, trying to make you think that you're equal with everybody else, you can feel better, and you can feel properly able to assert yourself as the true heroic European Englishman that you are. And then you can join with others. And here's some fitness tips, by the way. And if you buy my Bitcoin, you'll be rich as well. So this is a very different kind of appeal. This is the red pill. This is the kind of, we will reveal the truth to you. You can become a hero of your own story. But it has a kind of countercultural, exciting sort of appeal because you can feel like the outsider, the person who's against the state. And it can encompass not just racist politics, but versions of alternative health, conspiracy theories, and so forth. It's a very powerful, if complicated and mobile, very shifting political alliance, which can flood and flow across different kind of domains. It can go from the very far right, from the restore fascist right, to bits of the conservative right, to people who might not think of themselves as being very political. They just like driving a car and want to know why the price of petrol is going up and they can't go down that street anymore. But it can also bring in people. There's a certain kind of figure on the sort of reactionary right now that I recognise from my kind of youth, because there's kind of a lot of ex-ravers my age with their kind of smiley face bucket hats who've turned into fascists somehow, yeah? But in some way in their own minds have carried on a kind of countercultural hostility to the state and the cops and an idea about individuality and freedom and doing your own thing that has now become articulated to an anti-vaccine, anti-mainstream schooling, anti-this kind of form of politics that then becomes anti-immigration and anti-equality. So it's reactionary, it's got distinct styles and forms that are fed and shaped by digital culture, and it's a politics, right? But it's a complicated kind of politics. In some respects, it's a politics not tied to a simple party form, because it's spreading and flooding in much more complex, nuanced ways across different channels and in bringing in different people to use it. But of course, it is supported by Advance. Advance funded Danny Bones. People are retweeting Rupert Lowe and Farage and Reform are clearly watching this kind of world and knowing when to come in and use it and echo its politics and to use it. And there is, of course, behind that, a conscious mobilizing of this part of online culture by obviously the Elon Musks and so forth. But I think the main way to think about this is as a politics that is centered on the propagation of a vocabulary, a way of talking about, a way of thinking about, a way of understanding the political economic situation we're in. And that vocabulary is part of where the power lies, because it flows and spreads through. I've been looking at this stuff for over 12 years and watching kind of ideas like the cultural Marxist conspiracy theory move out of 4chan, move into below the line comments in the Spectator and the Telegraph, move into the articles in the Spectator and Telegraph, then come out in the speeches of Conservative Home Office ministers and even find its echoes, as we've heard, in the Labour Party as well. So that's part of what's going on here, is a vocabulary that is shifting, a way of understanding. So we immediately respond to, say, the horrors that we've been learning about this week and think, well, that must be about immigration. That's about EDI, obviously. And that becomes the way we understand and define those issues, or they get defined for us and shapes the politics around them. So what do we do about that? Well, I haven't got much time to say that. That would be a different talk. But it is about recognising there's many fronts, party, political and policy, but also a front that is cultural, that is ideological, that takes place online, that is about recognising, putting that diversity of people you talked about, who might be the audiences for this kind of stuff, and finding ways to challenge, not just challenge the vocabulary of reactionary digital politics, but to substitute for it a different vocabulary that shapes our politics. I hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you. Don't worry, Alan. In the next question, you can expand more on that. Also, everyone's microphones should be a bit louder now. Lee, do you mind? Yeah.
Yeah,
That sounds great. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Alan, thanks for that. Definitely some follow-up questions there to dive into. But first, last but certainly not least, we have Lee Andersson, who is a member of European Parliament. She served as the Minister of Education from 2019 to 2023 in Finland and is the former leader of the Left Alliance. She was a member of Parliament from 2015 to 2024, and she was also chair of the party's youth wing, Left Youth. Great. So Lee, great to have you with us in London. Thanks so much. Can you tell us a bit more about what different strategies you're seeing from institutional actors and parties, kind of what they're applying and developing in response to the far right, or even ones you yourself are applying within your roles? Very curious to hear about this kind of from the broader initiatives at the European level, and also kind of your really incredible work in Finland and beating the far right there. So, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I thought I would speak a little bit about the European context first when we talk about the radical right. I know you are mostly focused on reform, but I do think it's important to speak about the broader international context because none of these actors are acting in a vacuum. It's very clear if we talk about their digital presence. This is a global phenomenon. They are strengthening each other. They are shared concepts, shared strategies. So understanding what is happening in the UK is also understanding what is happening in broader international context. And I will be focusing on Europe because that's what I'm looking at the moment from the point of view of European Parliament. But it's equally important, I think, to stress the fact that this is a global phenomenon. So we could talk about Milei, Bolsonaro, Modi, and so on, also remembering that dimension. So I will be Eurocentric. Apologies for that. But just a few comments first on who is the radical right, because I think we still encounter both a media and academic discourse regarding these actors that focus very much on difference. So there's a lot of discussions on who is extreme right, who is just far right, who is the radical right. You have a lot of media coverage on focusing on fragmentation, focusing on, the MAGA movement is split over Iran, AfD is no longer happy with Trump, they have different attitudes towards Russia, and then you also have academics that focus on this issue, and rightly so. I mean, from the point of view of their academic interests, are very interested in categorization. So who falls into the extreme right category and who is more in the far right, and how do they differ from each other? And if you have a first look, for example, at the European Parliament, you could say that maybe it collaborates this, general discourse on fragmentation, because what you see when you look at the far radical right in the European Parliament is that you see a large, quite diverse group of parties that are sitting in three different political groupings. So, for example, you also have a diverse group of leftist parties that are all sitting in one group called the left. But when you go to the right-wing spectrum, you have three separate. So you have a group called ECR, Conservatives and Reformists, where you will find the Finnish and the Swedish far-right parties. You have Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia in this group. You have Peace, Law and Order from Poland. These are all parties that have either governmental experience, they are in government, or they are supporting government parties. And interesting also, most of these parties are quite supportive of Ukraine. I will come back to this issue later. Also, this group has 3 representatives in council, which means that they have heads of government in 3 different countries at the moment: Italy, Belgium, and Latvia. Then you have the Patriots group, where you find Assemblée Nationale, the French extreme right, where you find Orban's Fidesz, Lega Nord, also government party, but then sitting in the other group than their companions from Italy. ANO from the Czech Republic, and PVV from the Netherlands, that used to be a government party. And also they have a representative in the council, which means that this group also has representation as head of government in the Czech Republic at the moment. And in the third group, European sovereign nations, you have AfD from Germany that could not fit in with the other ones anywhere. But my main thesis is that we should not be fooled, not by this fragmentation or by the discourses around, the extreme right, far right, the new radical right. Yes, they have differences when it comes to strategy, so political strategy, their attitude towards governing, for example, or how much of a disruptive way of doing politics you have in your respective countries. They have some differences on certain topics, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, mostly connected to foreign policy. But I think it's much more important to see and identify what unites all of these actors. And it's especially relevant when we talk, for example, about the cordon sanitaire, so the questions around the firewall, which has been very effectively torn down through arguments saying that some of these actors are more okay than others, usually then referring to the parties in the ECR group, which is the Nordic far-right parties and the Italians and so on. And from what I'm hearing also about the UK situation, I would argue that the same goes for reform and restore. That's the restore, right? By emphasizing the difference between them, it's also a very convenient way, I think, for reform to try and present themselves as like something less radical on the spectrum, when there is actually usual this more of a relationship of, as was said, a testing ground or a starting point maybe for policies and discourses, starting more at this end of the spectrum and then making their way throughout the rest. So focusing more on the similarities that was also partly all mentioned, I mean, the one common feature that unites the whole spectrum, of course, is their anti-immigration stance, and very specifically also anti-Muslim attitudes. And there you see, as was already mentioned, that we know this ethno-nationalist way of phrasing it, of rhetorics. So you still have basically, the same thinking as you had regarding race, just replaced by culture, emphasizing the incompatibility, incompatibility of coexistence of different cultures. So the opposition to equality. Because that's basically like the fundamental, I think, defining, uniting feature is this idea of hierarchy and an opposition to the fundamental principle of each human being equal. So this is also coupled to a very kind of narrow, of course, definition of the nation, like their strong opposition to diversity, everything, all policies aimed at strengthening this. We heard about their take on the liberal state. Very visible in how, for example, both Putin and Trump talk about Europe and the European Union, that for them represents the liberal state. Also for many of these far-right parties, saying, that it's the European values or it's the liberal state that has made Europe weak and created this moral decay. And they, of course, also all use rhetorics which aim at creating a sense of urgency. So this sense of our societies being at the verge of collapse because of these liberal policies. This is also a trait that historically has been uniting for different types of fascist movements, to create this sense in people that, the modern life is rubbish, as you say in Britain, I guess. That these values and these liberal ideas have created a situation where we are in an imminent risk of civilizational erasure or collapse. These phrases that they use. Interesting also, I think, when we look at these far-right parties, especially the ones that have gotten bigger, if you talk about where they get their support, who they are, is that, of course, in many countries, the anger and the sentiment that they have been very successful in using politically. Of course, it's linked to material conditions in many cases. But I think it's also important to note that when you talk about parties that have 18-20% support, it is not just working class, it crosses class divides. So they have been quite, or very successful actually in constructing political identities, collectives that are crossing class divisions based on identity-based categories where you build subjectivity based on this very, like, I call it hetero-patriarchal nationalism. Using, pride, for example, that you also talked about, these types of emotions. And that is also, I guess, like fundamentally what unites their electorate in a sense. And it is important to understand that if you look beyond that, you see class divisions, you see different type of issues that are important. But I think the main challenge also for other political movements is to kind of break through that collectivity and identity that they have been quite successful in building. So how they are doing at the moment, if we look at Europe, unfortunately is that they are strong and they're still getting stronger. There is also, I think, some interesting points about the different phases of development when you look at the new radical rights. So in the Nordic countries, such as Sweden and Finland, where they got big and got power, became quite institutionalized in the sense that you have a far-right party in the government. In my country, you have supporting the government in Sweden. They are now losing support in a way, so they're kind of a downhill trajectory because of the policies that they have been doing in government. The downside of this is, of course, that they have been able to legitimize themselves and also leave a very tangible effect on people's lives, mostly poor people and migrants in both of their countries where they have been led into power by the traditional right wing. Southwest Europe, looking at Spain and Portugal, especially at the moment, they have very strong upwing trajectories, so really becoming big, breaking into the mainstream of political field. Also extremely difficult times for the left in both of these countries, because they have clearly also made leftist movements their main objectives. And countries where they are big but outside formal influence still at this point, such as UK, Germany, and France, which then leads me to the quite worrying fact that when looking at what elections are coming up in Europe, you have all of these countries in the coming years. So France, the presidential election in 2027, extremely important because it is a country with a very strong presidential role. So the president has a lot of power. And Jordan Bardella, at the moment at least, polling first in the polls that are done in France. Spain, parliamentary elections in 2027. Also there with a possibility of Vox entering into some kind of coalition with the conservative right wing there, so making it into the sphere of influence. Italy, parliamentary elections in 2027. UK parliamentary elections 2029, and Germany parliamentary elections 2029. But also before that, in Germany, you have regional elections, and some regions, meaning that AfD might get a majority on their own, which would also secure them then representation inside the German political system. So I also have the counter strategies in the end. I don't know if I should go through them very quickly or leave it for the discussion.
We'll come back to it.
Okay, good. So maybe I'll just end on the point, looking at the European landscape, as I said, I think it is important to identify similarities, not to fall into this trap of categorization and difference, because then you really also see the dangers of the politics and the way that how far they have actually managed to emerge, these different actors, into the rooms of political decision making. And looking at the elections coming up here and in other countries, it makes it all the more important for us now to find the right way and to learn from the different places where they have found effective strategies on how to be able to counter these movements and parties.
Yeah, Lee, you listing kind of the election schedule over the next few years. Whew, yeah, I think would be the technical term. Yes, so we are going to kind of get to that. But each one of you kind of talked about kind of what do we do about this and what is the counter strategy here, and with a realistic understanding of what we're up against. So Lee, given that you were on a roll and you were ready to jump into that, maybe you can.
I can continue.
You can continue, and then we'll come back down this way.
Yeah, so I think I have a few examples. I have 4 examples of strategies. And I think none of them are like something you can do on its own. I think we should learn and take inspiration from what has worked to some extent in different places, and think about like how we can combine these strategies and also enact them in a way that's nationally and locally reasonable. So I think one strategy clearly has been to have strong leftist counter-narratives and also strong programs for economic transformation. And I'm actually thinking about Spain that I mentioned, because at the same time as you have seen increase in the support of Vox, Spain has also been a country in Europe that has managed to maintain a left-leaning government coalition for 8 years now, which is like better success than anyone else anywhere in Europe. And this also links to one of my fears that I have when it comes to the left, is that we are so focused on the radical right that in terms of policy making, we're starting to talk more about them than ourselves. So you kind of counter this, positioning that we are the strongest alternative to the far right, or like the strongest counter force, this rhetoric, and it's really, I think, talks to our own base, but what does it actually say to someone who does not necessarily yet identify as like a part of a leftist movement? So you also need to be able to talk about, like, have a strong narrative of who you are, what are you doing and why. And I think Sanchez has been good at this. I think you can say that there has been successes in Spain in kind of keeping this strong counter narrative, whether it's foreign policy or employment policy or economic policy, kind of showing that it's possible to do things in a different way. And also, of course, then doing things that economically change the material conditions for people. I think Mamdani in New York is another example of this, having like very strong narrative of your own, but also proposals really to enact economic transformation, whether it's about cheaper groceries or it's about cheaper childcare or it's about higher minimum wage, as they have been doing in Spain. Another example I will take is La France Insoumise from France. I think they're interesting in terms of how you can build these political subjects or collective subjects on the left that also cross quite different types of class or groups of people. Because they have somehow been able to quite well combine, I think, to build like this political subject that combines very academically, very academically oriented people, young voters, and what some would call like urban proletariat. So like really like working class voters, in a way where they have not like complicated this in some kind of discourse on who is like a real legitimate leftist voter or the legitimate representative of the working class, but really having quite, I think, like being able to construct really inclusive, interesting political subjects. They have not been able to break out into the rural areas yet, so I think that is also like the biggest challenge when talking about France. I think also Mamdani is interesting in this regard, once again, because he has also been able to, through these material demands, cheaper collective transport, cheaper childcare, groceries, again, unite very different types of voters around collective demands that can speak to them all. And he also had a very good way, I think, in his campaign of showing diversity as a matter of fact. So like showing who we are and what societies look like without kind of making it into like a subject for political debate. I don't know if I can phrase this in English correctly, so I hope you understand. Like he showed and he did, but he did not enter into a discussion on like whether you're pro or con multiculturalism. It's like, it is. And I think you did it really well. Other types of, I think Finland, Sweden, and Belgium at the moment are also interesting examples of mobilizing against the far right as an anti-austerity mobilization. So where they have gained power and have done what they actually do when they get power, which is austerity policies. In Finland, they have done really harsh anti-trade union policies as well. So really like focusing on building broad movements opposed to that, and also using those examples internationally, I think, for exposing these parties for what their economic and labor market policies really are. So working together internationally, also of using examples of what these parties do when they actually get power. And last, but absolutely not least, focusing on grassroots organizing and spaces. I didn't talk that much about Poland and Hungary. Hungary is, I think, a really interesting example. Also, I mean, we can have a long discussion about what TISA is and is not, that now won the election. But what they did to get rid of Orban, that has maybe not gotten that much attention internationally, is that they had a massive campaign with on the rural areas, very small communities. They were massively present in Hungary for several years, mobilizing against Orban with popular events, discussions, in very, like, even in very small places in the rural areas, and also using the feedback they got from people in their electoral platform against Orban. And I think, once again, this shows to the importance of, like, really going back to the basics of all types of mobilizing and organizing and focusing on these very kind of traditional, but I would also argue somewhat forgotten methods of reaching out to people. We also have the very successful examples of door-knocking campaigns. I'm from Germany, bringing back Die Linke. And I also heard Die Linke people saying that they think this is the best type of anti-fascist policy, is actually to knock on people's doors and have the discussion face-to-face, because that's the best way of bridging the wars in the digital sphere. And we have seen, I mean, PTB in Belgium also focusing very much on this type of local organizing. So, and there's also all of this interesting research done on how losing common spaces in different municipalities also actually you have been able to link it to the rise of the far right. So just creating spaces, being present, focusing on this type of very local organizing, I think is also one key factor. And no one, of course, has managed to, find a golden solution to get rid of them altogether. But I think we have very inspiring examples of pushback being possible, electoral victories being possible. And I think by combining like parts of all of these strategies, I really think is possible also to get results, meaning that they will not be able to enter into the halls of power. Thanks.
Absolutely. I love the inclusion of the public spaces there too. And I'll be curious kind of to hear Alan's take on the face-to-face conversation as we're talking about the influence on the digital culture piece. Alan, your microphone should be working if you want to give it a...
It is, yes.
Yeah, woo, great.
Okay. Do you want me to speak specifically about face-to-face or more broadly about...
You're welcome to speak more broadly, but if you wanted to hit on that point.
I mean, I could, but I think I'm just going to say sort of what you said, but not so eloquently, because I think I agree with everything. Which isn't great for an exciting talk,
it's
is it?
wonderful.
But I think that, well, I suppose I would say, building on partly what you've said and what I kind of said and what you said as well, would be, I'm wary that academics fall into the trap of sort of trying to make politics into a really good seminar, and it isn't. But I do think that part of the labour is an intellectual one on our parts to kind of think very hard about equality and what we mean by that and how we understand that and know some of our history about that, and also understand what the opposition means and why it's opposed to equality. So I think there is some kind of conceptual work to do there, so that we can then represent our cause intellectually and in our lives, and to think rhetorically about how we promote and express and make real a politics of equality. Because it's very easy, I think, I don't want to get into a long thing, but we can sometimes present that as a sort of moralistic kind of claim, and in which our politics is about making people feel bad for not being equal or treating people equally, as opposed to welcoming people into the joy of trying to live collectively and commonly around the principle that we start from, that we are all equal in this room. We know that people are different and have different kind of skills and abilities of all sorts. Of course they do. We celebrate that. But we want to, we just take it as a principle of organisation that we start on an equal footing. And I think part of that is trying to find, and again, let me be careful, I don't think we should give any quarter to Reform or Restore, or actually the Conservative Party. But I think when it comes to, say, you mentioned kind of Restore's electoral victories and their MPs in Yarmouth, and I know Yarmouth well, I think finding a way to interact with people in Yarmouth and to recognise that people in a city like that feel deeply shat on and deeply disrespected by the world, and part of our politics of equality is trying to treat people with some kind of respect, even as you say, no, I'm not having that. No, I disagree with that. That's not, and finding a way to cultivate those relationships, not with members and supporters necessarily, but with the people who might be the audience for those kinds of politics. That's part of enacting our approach. And secondly, in terms of organisation, again, I agree with you. I do think that parties are a fundamental part of democratic politics and will be, and people may be members. I'm sure some people in this room are members of political parties, but we have to have horizons that exceed single parties and think about the ways in which you mentioned France Insoumise. How do parties find, or those of us who are in parties or not, find ways to collaborate across and between those lines? And a lot of that will, I think, be local. So I think the local area is absolutely important, and I think there are very practical reasons for also focusing on the local. You have to be, sometimes people say I shouldn't talk in a way that makes it seem like I think Reform will win, because it will make it happen. But you also have to act on the assumption that it might happen and therefore be ready for it. And part of that is going to be thinking locally now, are the relevant groups connected? Because the thing to remember is there's still more of us than them. Every poll tends to suggest that. It's close sometimes. But in a town like mine, the Methodists, the Quakers, the mosques, the churches can be brought together. We, as it were, have people in. We know we have people in the food banks. We run the food banks. We have people in the schools. We have a lot of resources around, and we are in a position to be able to collaborate and support each other. But anyway, we need that sort of infrastructure in place. We need a version of, a long time ago when we were most worried about nuclear war. We had people had like telephone trees to get people out on the street when they knew the weapons were moving. We need some kind of version of that brings people together to say, right, we're ready to act, we're ready to go and defend people, we're ready to support people. We're building that is also, that resilience is also a way of building the movement that prevents it happening in the first place. It's having that sort of local kind of alliance where we can be practicing our politics and ready to act and bring people in. Bring in the trade unions, bring in the hospitality workers, and begin building that movement now. And then, so this sounds like a really banal thing to say at the end of all that, at the end of your fantastic remarks. But when it comes back to the digital, a key problem is that the radical right is really good at being solidaristic online. Despite all these divisions, as you say, they're unified. They promote each other. They have each other on their channels. They push it around. They fund it, and we don't do that. And that's partly because we can't fund it. It's partly because we are really good at disagreeing about things. So we need to find ways to collaborate. So actually, if you are online, post stuff, promote stuff. Yeah, this isn't me begging to go on Joe's podcast, but having people connected across and seeing themselves as part of the same team, as it were, and saying, which I mean, by the way, you should listen to Joe's podcast, Life of the Party. It's brilliant, and other ones as well, and be part of promoting that wider culture. And those are small things, and so that we can be part of promoting the politics and the ideology that we are representing. Yeah.
Anki, is there anything that you want to add? I'm sure you have some good thoughts there.
There's really not loads that I have to add. I do feel like it was covered very well. I'm not annoyed, I'm only joking. You've stitched me up. No, I guess the only thing I would say is that unfortunately, the far right are quite good at doing a lot of the community organising in the UK that we used to do. If you go on, for example, the website of Patriotic Alternative, a neo-Nazi organisation, they do litter picks together. They go on nature hikes with their families. They sometimes fundraise to help support people. One of them runs a soap business. There's lots of kind of little nice things that I'm sure lots of us or lots of people in our communities are also doing, but it's not necessarily getting out there in the same way, or it's not creating a feeling of outreach and of including people. And yeah, I'm possibly at risk of repeating what Alan said, but I've written down that, you know, there is a real need for us to have solidarity, for us to reach out and actually reach out to across a lot of people who are voting in a way that we don't like, because that's exactly what they are trying to break down. There are two big divides that I see so commonly, and I think they are so persuasive, almost to the point that sometimes when I'm watching these reform press conferences, I'm like, God, the internal logic really does follow. You have to step back and realize it's not true, but they create this false dichotomy between hardworking alarm clock Britain and scroungers, their words not mine, either people who are seeking asylum or people who have immigrated to the UK who are trying to like game the system in some way, or possibly also people from the UK who are living on welfare, who are living on benefits. We know that most immigration to the UK is people who have come here to legally work. We know that a lot of people who claim benefits or some forms of welfare are also in employment, and therefore, you know, both giving and taking into the system. I don't think we make these points enough, and we don't also create this sense that these are like no-nonsense, common sense parts of our society. The things we like about the state, we should never give up on them. We kind of let these narratives exist out there, and I feel like if we're not able to find that solidarity and also in a way that isn't smug, because I did a focus group with progressive voters to say, you know, what is it that really bothers you about reform? And I was really dismayed to see one respondent say, it's their voters, they're scum. Like, that is just really the opposite of what we need right now, and it worries me a lot, because I feel like there's a lot of joy on the left of diagnosing the problem and kind of pointing fingers, dissecting what's happened. And actually some of us, and I actually challenged myself to do this too, because I could do more, but like, we need to roll our sleeves up and leave the house and just like talk to a few people and have a bit of patience on a person-to-person level, as well as all of the structural things that I think the other two have so eloquently put across.
Thank you all. It's come to that time, audience Q&A. I know people have questions, so I will maybe do one or two at a time, and then whoever wants to take it, and then we'll go back for more. Yes, I have one here, and then also in the blue here. And I will bring you a microphone.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was actually very, very enlightening. It was amazing to hear these things discussed. I'm actually wondering what question I'm going to ask you, because I thought of so many when your talk was going. I guess the one that comes to the fore, sorry, my name is Phoebe, by the way. The one that comes to the fore is I live in Sweden, and there has been a huge uptick in right-wing ideology, I guess, across the whole country. In the last election, a party called Moderaterna got in, which is the equivalent to, I guess, the Conservatives. And then there's been a huge rise in the most far-right party, which is the Sverigedemokraterna, which is the Swedish Democrat Party. And I actually know some people who are in the Vänsterpartiet, which is the left party, within the Politburo of Gothenburg, in the city where I live. And I was chatting to them. So, what is your digital outreach strategy? Do you have one? And they made a great point, which was very similar to what you said, which was, we're on the streets, we are canvassing, we are at people's doors, we are doing this the old school way, and this is how we're going to make real gains within our community. And I was like, totally correct. But what is your digital outreach strategy? Because this is why the right has been rising so much in Sweden, because they have huge amounts of funding. You know, they've got bot farms. There's so much going on online, and people are really engaging with that, because Sweden is quite I don't want to say like individualist, or maybe like a little bit disconnected society, like historically. That's kind of the way that the world is there. And I'm wondering what you would say we could do as a digital strategy to increase maybe the volume of stuff that we can get out, so we can actually counter this. Because I know that from what was one of the stories you brought up earlier was this Sri Lankan guy who was putting out really low grade content, which was literally like some flags on on a cliff and with some emotive music playing in the background, and this can like galvanize people towards voting potentially towards the right. So how can we counter that kind of stuff when a lot of left-wing or like progressive ideology is requiring quite a little bit of analysis or some historical depth? You know, it's like more difficult to impart that level of information in such a short amount of time in like a short format content. Sorry, that was really drawn out, but I hope you can draw something from that.
Just to build on that, I was wondering, with that language of the right, what would you say the language of the left is to build that big tent that you're discussing? Just to build.
Should we do one more? Or? Let's do 3.
Cheers. My one's quite quick, hopefully. I just wanted to know what you all thought of the idea of just banning social media, because I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, but it seems like maybe one of the only levers that's actually on the table that governments are kind of willing to entertain. And I guess, yeah, on a personal note, I ask it because I'm from near Boston, which is the town that had the highest leave vote in the UK, and I did a bit of research about 5 years ago with people from there and the villages surrounding and stuff. And I would say at that point in time, they were like the type of people you're talking about, where they were considering voting for the right or like far right parties, whatever. And I'm still in touch with a lot of them, and I still speak or like lurk in a lot of the Facebook groups that I was meeting them in at the time as well. And they have been so radicalized in the past 5 years. And I just don't know if like in-person stuff can keep pace with that. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Will. All right, anyone want to jump in on any of those 3 kind of digital infrastructure pieces, language of the left, or social media writ large?
I'm trying not to be the first person to answer so I can think about these difficult questions more. Because this is where I sort of, I wish I could say, well, here I have a sheet of 10 words you could use, and it doesn't work that way. Yes, I mean, to Phoebe, I agree with you. The street is important, but it's just an unavoidable fact that the primary locations of ideological recruitment in the present day are online. And probably of those, the primary is YouTube, right? Although that doesn't quite make sense because everything's on YouTube or on TikTok and it flows across, yeah? So you have absolutely no choice if you're a serious political movement to be on there, and they should be on there. And on there means on the main platforms, yeah, YouTube, the big influencers, but what I'm also talking about is people we need to be in the car forums, in the kind of local, which when I say that, I don't want to be in car forums. I don't have, yeah, that's not where I am, right? But somebody, whoever knows about cars, should be in the car forums, right? In the Town F Facebook group, in the different kind of locations. So, in part of what digital does is it paradoxically kind of like, it makes politics everywhere, where everything becomes politicised in a strange sort of way, not in the way we used to mean by everything is political. Your Star Wars movies, your Doctor Who's become political, your diet becomes a manifestation of your position on natural manhood and looks maxing. Everything becomes politicised, but at the same time, everything, it then becomes really hard to work out what's actually a political statement and what isn't. But what that means is that the right has become quite good at sort of permanently engaging in its political expression in all forums and all forms all the time, which is sort of what the left used to be. So it's kind of a matter of getting back there, and not in a way that is kind of, I don't mean like we should be permanently kind of hectoring everybody, but recognising that in all these places and all these moments, it might be worth pushing back in some way and being part of that. But crucially, it means parties ought to be investing in their YouTube channel, for example. And the example I always usually give at talks, but I wouldn't sort of give here, because this isn't sort of necessarily a Labour Party room, but the Labour Party, last time I checked, had about 60,000 followers on YouTube, subscribers on YouTube, and it makes these little kind of pointless 3-minute videos that a few hundred people watch. Yeah, the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. Anyone heard of that one? See, hardly anybody, right? That's Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, horrible person. Long-term kind of YouTuber. He's on that with other people. That gets about has 500,000 subscribers, right? So 10 times as much as the ruling party. And they don't make little videos; they make long videos. And and they give people reading lists, right? I mean, the reading list is often like tweets. It's nonsense, yeah? But you can see it's self-conceived of as an educative project of recruitment to a movement, to a worldview that welcomes people into it. And if the left or parties are not there, what are they complaining about? They're going to be losing, right? But that then comes to the question of what's the language of the left, yeah? So I can't give you like 10 key things to say, because of course that's not how we think about politics, right? But I think maybe the issue would be to say, what do we mean by language in a sense, yeah? It's partly about how we kind of orient ourselves to people, you know, what ways do we kind of show some, you know, not making people feel like we think they're awful without necessarily being cuddly to people who are awful. And positioning ourselves. So I think it's partly about finding that broader ways in which we position ourselves and being in the digital room for those kinds of conversations. But I would also say crudely, I think bring back the vocabulary that we used to have. The ruling class. Let's just talk about the ruling class for once, yeah? Not just the rich. We can talk ultra-rich billionaires, but the ruling class. Begin to propagate a vocabulary that understands things in class terms and doesn't immediately kind of concede to the frame of the other. So, again, I don't want to get caught up in talking about Southampton because I do think families should be respected in that case. But I think, you know, you can see how one could talk about that issue in terms of we've underfunded policing and police training for a long time, and that's what's going wrong here. Yeah? This is an issue of austerity and cuts, and this is an issue of inequality. Some places are very well policed because that's where the rich people are, and other places are not well policed. So begin to move to those kinds of issues and refuse the racialized framing that is coming out and bring things back to equality, and not make the mistake of a kind of politics in which we end up not talking about equality. But we take it as these are issues of equality. Who gets properly treated and protected? There's a kind of phrase that floats around online, and it's not clear who authored it. It's a definition of conservatism, which says, and it's right. It says conservatism is the philosophy that some people should be protected by the law, but not constrained by it. Other people should be constrained by the law, but not protected by it. And that's the situation in which we do live. And we should be both calling that out, but also advocating the positive version of equality that we want to talk about. And should we ban social media? Well, I mean, there's a complicated issue about things like the age bans and so forth. It's not possible to do that. That isn't going to happen, yeah? And that's where I think so. And I think we have to maybe resist the instinct that the response to things is always to regulate them, because that's sort of asking the state to do the political work of ideological contestation online. I do think there are legitimate things to regulate and issues to resist, but I think that, you know, if we just sit around saying, I wish they'd regulate deep fakes, well, get more and more deep fakes get produced. We need to be in the kind of the ideological trenches, working in the deep in the minds of TikTok.
Anyone else want to jump in on some of those? Anki, you want to go first maybe, and then later? Okay. A really good question. So, of course, you need a digital outreach strategy. I think it's like the problem is that I think many political movements focused quite a lot on that, and not at all actually on the other parts of the strategy that we need, like the local organizing and being present. But for what? I think like. Social media, a good digital strategy is like really important, just as was asked about the language of the left. I think also in how like leftist movement creates their own subjects. Is it a very good tool for kind of finding the voters that are voting reform here or the far right? No, I don't think so. I think there you kind of really see how the algorithm actually works in the opposite ways. I mean, it feeds off of this affect and comment. So I think most of the times, if the goal and the strategy is really to find the voters that are leaning in that direction, I do think that the face-to-face organizing is much more effective than a good digital outreach strategy. But that's just my opinion. So they have kind of different objectives and different target groups. The language of the left to build a big tent is such a good question.
I probably is the only one here that should say I have the answer to that, but I don't. I think there are like things we need to think about. I think this question of how we build collective identities in the world we live in now is super, super interesting, because I have this, for me, very important experience, which was already a million years ago when I was in the Left Youth Organization, and we had this training for new members. So they were really young and like really new in the whole left scene, and I asked them like, how many of you identify with the concept with the concept of working class? And none of them raised their hands. And when I asked them like, how many of you support universal basic income, they all raised their hands. Because I think also like the way society has become, where we're so stratified, you know, like look at the labor market, it's really hard to build collective identities by trying to say that you are this, like you are also that, like coming from somewhere, from someone else. So at least for them, finding kind of a material demand was actually what united them as a collective, because they all understood how a universal basic income would change their lives for the better in their very precarious labor market situation, or students and so on. And for me, this has kind of stuck with me for like 20 years. So I do think one way, an important way of finding the right language for the left is to find the right demands, like these collective demands that can unite people that that do have common material interests, but do not necessarily identify as a collective just because someone says you're all working class or you're all the precariat. And that's why I think it's been so inspiring to see the Mamdani campaign with the transport and childcare and groceries and stuff, that it seems like it really works also to formulate it in this way. Other things you should think about when you talk about your languages, of course, I mean, I think the radical right has been really good at having a very clear explanation of what is wrong with the world. It's like it's a liberal state and it's migrants. And if you ask a leftist what is wrong with the world at the moment, like why are we in the state we are, I think most of us would end up in this like long, financial crisis and blah, 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 the structures and the banks and they have billionaires and everything. So having like a very understandable explanation for that, you need, as a part of the left language, to build a big tent. You need to know who your enemies are. You always need that for political discourse. That's also kind of a way of doing the class-based politics without talking about the ruling class or talking about the billionaires or talking about the elite or whatever word you use, but you need to have an understanding of who the enemy is and a way to express that. And then I think you also need to be able to work with affect. Pride is very difficult, but I do think it's very important, especially when you talk about, look at the many voters that are voting for the far-right parties. Like, how do we communicate that? Like, what can you be proud of? Or what can we be proud of together? Also, maybe using affect against your enemies can also be a good way. I think many actors are starting more to use this ridiculing the far right, maybe more than demonizing it in a way. This seemed as, at least in the digital sphere, a much more effective way of kind of taking them down to the same level where we all the rest of us operate. So maybe that's at least some parts of what the left should think about when in terms of our own language. I don't think, I don't support banning social media, and I think that the whole tech industry we should think and talk more about from the lens of capitalism. I mean, we have too big companies, we have too much concentration of wealth and power. That is the big problem with social media at the moment, the tech oligarchs, and the way that they can exert influence through these big companies. So I would address the issue through that lens.
All right, I think we're gonna just take some more questions because we got pretty thorough answers on those. Okay, yes, my friend here in the gorgeous cardigan, and anyone else want to hop in? Perfect. And anyone else? We can do up to 3. Okay, in the back there. Perfect.
Hello. Oop, that was a bit loud. Hi, my name is Jun. Thank you for your time on the talk today. I've got some comments and maybe like a question each. So yeah, firstly, Anki, I think I completely agree with you in terms of how we need to stop this sort of like demonization and meet people with the common grounds, you know, the struggles of disenfranchisement and inequality and things like that. I think we need to like kind of bridge the gap between the left and the right, which I think in itself is a bit of a false dichotomy to like separate everyone. But the struggles are common and unified. I think you made a point about like sort of, you know, grassroots mobilization and things, and we've seen it with pro-Palestinian movements, but the state is becoming more and more authoritarian. We're seeing like Filton 25 get, you know, what's the word, like put in prison for terrorism acts and stuff. So how do you suppose we can carry on this sort of effective direct action campaign grassroots movement to counter to go against the tide? And for Alan, yeah, and I think you touched upon it, and I'm just going to build on that as well. In terms of like, you know, mainstream media, social media, all being now owned by like the Anderssons and the tech billionaires. I think you can actually see it, like my partner here, Phoebe, makes some pro-Palestinian content on TikTok, and her views have shot down significantly since the Andersson takeover. So they have the control of the algorithms to keep you in this an echo chambers, and you know, just sharing and creating content doesn't feel enough. Like they are getting all the multipliers from this with the echo chamber, whilst the left is getting suppressed. And so how do you suppose we can counteract that? And for you, all the parties that you mentioned, and I'm going to get a little bit tinfoil here, but like Epstein Files mentioned all of those parties, with Bannon's The Movement, I think is a Brussels-based think tank, talking about funding the far-right movements across Europe to disrupt things. You know, Tommy Robinson's person you mentioned, Sosa Farage, yeah, on matters of immigration. I think the language that I like and increasingly seeing more is the Epstein class, like ruling class, the elite class, that kind of like exalts them a bit, but like Epstein class, I think, puts them in the right place. Now my question really is, how do you suppose, you know, obviously in terms of like grassroots movements translated into political movements, but again, the political parties get the funding through these sort of backdoor like crypto billionaires to sort of emphasize their messaging, especially within the far right sphere. How can we counteract that?
Hey guys, yeah, thanks so much for that. It was genuinely really fascinating. I've just got 2 really quick questions. I think one's just on leadership and the role of visible leadership in counteracting the far right, because you know, you guys have cited lots of incredible political leaders, or Mamdani amongst them, and I've always been struck by how leaders like Mamdani or AOC or similar characters can almost cheat code social media platforms that usually wouldn't promote that kind of politics, right? Because they have a sense of momentum behind them, they've got charm, they've got charisma that, you know, just seems to cut through in a way which we struggle to if we don't have those leaders to express that. The thing I'll always remember is going on the Daily Mail website for my sins and seeing an AOC committee video just there. So it was like her presiding over a committee in the Congress in the US. A completely innocuous video, but she does some kind of like slap back to a Republican politician. Why the Daily Mail carrying that? It's obviously not their ideology or their politics. They carry it because it gets clicks, it gets views, it works in the attention economy, you know? So like it just feels like, yeah, supporting people to be candidates and be very visible leaders in different ways is incredibly important, especially because it's just so hard to be a leader these days. There's so much scrutiny on you. You have to be available 24/7. It's not like it was a couple of decades ago before social media and before 24-hour news. So I'd like you guys to talk about leadership and maybe the importance of that. And then just on pride, like, I feel like pride in place is an incredibly important affect, and one that maybe for people in this room is not dominant, but for lots of people in the country is. I feel like for kind of city level and municipal projects, that's easier, because you can have pride in being a Londoner, or in the Mamdani example, pride in being a New Yorker. But that's this kind of open and expansive identity that doesn't have either right-wing or racialized or negative connotations to it. Once you get to the nation-state level and you're talking about pride in nation and pride in your country, I feel like for the left it gets a lot trickier. And that for me is one of the key distinctions between the success of a Mamdani-like character and then trying to copy that onto the national stage. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that too.
I think like the word enemies it's not very helpful, because you should really focus on the ideas, and I think Restore are a great, like their YouTube and short clips are great to listen to, because they don't really have time to faff about. They're like, multiculturalism, it's shit. And then you start to see that where they win is where there's quite homogenous communities. And so I think, it's a bit tough, but sometimes you do have to talk about stuff like mixed race marriages and stuff like that, stuff that they avoid, and they don't want to talk about multiculturalism. But at the end of the day, people who support them think that multiculturalism is other people. It's like, no, you live in the UK. We had an empire for 300 years. You are the multiculturalism. It doesn't matter what part of the UK you live in. You're supporting that multiculturalism. You make it happen. When you want food at 1 a.m., that's a Muslim person delivering it. So don't kid yourself that your multiculturalism is somewhere else. But it's tough. But I think enemies is not very helpful. It has to be about ideas. And that's where they're winning, because that quick reaction, multiculturalism is shit, seems to be getting into people's heads and sticking.
Okay. Anyone want to jump in on any sets of those questions? Yeah, Anki, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually going to push back a bit on the enemies thing, not just to defend Lee, but also because I think Neon, a great organisation, I think maybe some people are here, we've done a bit of work on this idea that, like, to come back to the question of what would the language of the left be, there's this idea of a narrative triangle where we need to make people understand that they are victims, not in a way that encourages victimhood, but the whole reason why Britain is broken, Britain needs reform is a great tagline, is because people do kind of feel like Britain is broken. Paradoxically, they think their own local area is really good, and they're also positive about lots of things, but Britain is broken does land, so that victimhood lands. But we need to be the heroes, and we need to show them why our movements and our solutions and our causes are better. And I don't think we can tell that story compellingly without having a really clear idea of who the villains are. If you leave that bit ambiguous, we all know what that space gets filled with. When there's a vacuum, it gets filled with brown people, essentially. And so I would just kind of push back on the idea that actually I think even in the story that you're telling, there is an implicit villain there, right? There's the companies that own Deliveroo that have created the gig economy that essentially people who are in incredibly precarious economic situations have to be part of. We might not be naming it all the time, but if we don't, then the Deliveroo driver becomes the villain, and I think that's dangerous territory. I also wanted to pick up on your point about this idea of, like, what is the struggle of the left and the right? Because I also think we need to look at how much political fracture there's been. If there still was a left and the right, there would only be the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. We are so far away from that now. And there are these different axes of, cultural concerns, cultural conservatism, and also different attitudes towards the economy. I think a tough pill that I have had to swallow is that this whole idea of, like, socially liberal, fiscally conservative is very rare. Actually, a lot of people in the UK are relatively socially conservative and quite economically liberal, and the economy is the field on which we can own the argument. There are lots of people who are, concerned about some of the culture war-y topics that progressive left can get dragged onto. And I don't just mean dragged onto, there are, of course, incredibly incredibly important causes. We have to defend people's rights are being eroded. But if we're trying to build a big tent, we also need to focus on the areas where we can have stuff in common. And I think Lee spoke to that really compellingly. And actually, just finally, on that idea of protests, I'll leave the leadership question to the others, but just on the idea of protest rights being eroded, I've just been doing a piece of research that hasn't come out yet, but I was really curious to see that on a question that asked people what their thoughts were on the right to protest has been taken away from us. Actually, people who'd be happy with a reform government are more concerned about that than people who would be unhappy with a reform government. This is potentially an area of overlap for us all to be defending our civil liberties. And, you know, there is a question of what people have in mind, because a Palestine demo and a Unite the Kingdom rally have very different timbres to them, no matter how hard the Daily Mail tries to present them as the same, or, you know, violence and thuggery. They are very different, and they create different atmospheres of fear amongst people. But this idea that politicians or that the government is trying to kind of control how people respond, the use of facial recognition, the rollback of human rights in that field, those could really be topics on which we agree, and we start to draw some consensus that I think is like relatively underexplored.
So first, I mean, I also have to defend my argument about the enemies. So, I mean, looking at the far right, multiculturalism is shit. Yes, maybe, but I mean, their rhetoric is not only about ideas. They have very clear villains. I mean, that is, they use it all the time. So I think, I mean, using them doesn't really make the argument. So to have this clear way of describing why the world is as it is, I do think, and I agree, that you need to be able to say whose fault it is, who made this, why, who can you blame for your life, for your world or your community being in the state that it is. So you need to be able to name the villains. When it comes to leadership, I think it is extremely important, and maybe it has been a bit difficult for the left. Because, you know, it's like an inbuilt characteristic of leftist movements that we are collectives, right? We don't like to put leaders on pedestals. Like, most leftists kind of get really allergic to this kind of fandom thing around politicians. It's like, it makes me uncomfortable. But I'm also like, but we need leaders that inspire. You need talking heads. I mean, you need the people who can be the ones to be the talking head of the language of the left, right? And especially, I mean, in the digital world, you need to have the few people that actually are popular enough or good enough so that the algorithm and the way, I mean, it works actually starts benefiting the left project, because that's basically what's happened in their case. So I guess, like, important question then is, like, how do we support leadership and leaders? I mean, sometimes they are maybe not worthy of it, but in many times, I guess, like, part of left culture can also be like overcritical of leadership in also in situations where it's maybe not the most strategic choice. So how do we build collectives to support them, and how do we create movements that also create new leaders? I mean, that's, I guess, one of the most important questions then in this regard. Pride on national level is a very interesting topic. I had this discussion in my own party about, like, who we talk about in our own communications. Because we have also a tendency, when you're in a party, you become, like, it's a bit of a sect sometimes. I say with all due love and respect for parties. Like, we have this, you know, you start talking this way, you know, we in the Left Alliance think that, blah, blah, blah. We as leftists, blah, you know, and we in the left propose this, and as leftists, you know, this is very normal. You kind of fall into this type of language. And we did this test once. I talked with the party leadership, like, what if we would switch all of the times we see people leftists to talk about Finland and Finns? And it feels really uncomfortable. Like we as Finns think that Finland for us is like we want to try and claim that concept. And it was a bit uncomfortable, but I do think it's something we should do at least more. Maybe not all the time, but like see when it could work. Because this is what they do, right? They claim this concept all the time. The Finnish people is this and that. And there is no counter-narrative on the left, usually not at least. Like somebody saying that actually Finnish people are think or feel this way. Because then we could also try and create subject around that. And I do think that at least in a Nordic context, there are things also national level that you can claim pride in. You have a welfare state created by, the working class and the trade unions and a lot of, I think, things that a vast majority of voters appreciate that we can talk to also on national level. So hopefully there's also those kinds of structures left in the UK. You are better to answer that than I am.
So these are really hard questions, and they're especially hard to answer when they've had brilliant answers from everybody already. So just to add my tiny little bit in, I mean, on the enemies question, I don't think that enemies and ideas are enemies to each other. They're sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes, and there is no politics without naming something as your enemy. Your enemy may not be a person or a group. Your enemy can be an abstraction, can be greed. But I think there is a virtue in naming, the cause of the problems we want to address, which I think is the ruling class that leeches all the wealth out of the country. But I think the problem for the left at the moment, one way to think about it, is that because we have been made the enemy, even though we may not identify with the liberal state, is that we end up in a position of sort of defensively trying to kind of make excuses for essentially kind of the bureaucratic state machine. And I think we've got trapped into that position. We have to come out of that position. I mean, I do think the state is quite helpful in many respects. See, I'm going to do it now. And I do believe in regulation, and I do believe in sometimes the delivery of state services. But we have to not be in the position of just defending that and defending by default the status quo. So I think the issue about enemies is about overcoming that and saying, no, this is the problem over here, and we're going to change that and get rid of that and do something about that. In terms of leadership, I think that's such a great question and a very difficult question for the reasons that Lee said. But leadership, I think we should not be afraid of leadership. Leadership is a function in an organisation. You need someone to chair a meeting. You need someone to tell us when to shut up. That's a function, right? We can still be equal in that. And we need someone to say, right, we're done, we're going to go and do this after that discussion. Otherwise, nothing happens. But another part of that function, which I think is what you're getting at, is it's symbolic. And that maybe is the bit that makes us more uneasy, right? That to some degree, leaders embody some kind of like ideal or even a mythic type, right? The cowboy in US politics, right? The kind of hero figure, the kind of dashing Kennedy or whatever it is, yeah? And that makes us uncomfortable because part of us still thinks politics should be kind of rational. I think we just have to kind of get over it, yeah? But in part, get over it by recognizing that leaders have that. Charisma is not something that comes from within an individual. Charisma is a relationship between an individual and an audience. We grant it to people, just like we grant people on the stage. Yeah, you can be Macbeth. Great, we'll go with that. I think we should accept that that's part of what's happening, because that's part of the process by which a collective learns about itself, recognizes itself through figures that articulate and express something about its character. And when people choose a Trump over Kamala Harris, they're making a kind of choice about themselves and who they think they are. So AOC is, to have one truly gifted politician is amazing. To have two, Mamdani as well, is extraordinary. Yeah. Now they weren't born; they were made. That's practice and training, in part. But then the question is, what is it that does it? How is it they're doing it? And again, I don't want to go on at great length, but in the UK context, it would be one would want to think about how the way mainstream politicians' language is so desiccated in this country, so stylized and structured, that the moment someone breaks the rules and says something wrong or offensive or extreme, like a Farage, even I go, oh, thank God. Right? And that's the appeal of a Farage, that's the appeal of Polanski. It's recognising that kind of performing that role of, look, there's this game been going on and we're fed up with that game, so we're going to talk differently, and I'm going to be blunt and I'm going to give answers and have that dispute and that argument. Every time Farage is on the radio and just disagrees with the journalist, a little bit of me is like, that was the right thing to do. Yeah, he made the right move there. So I think we can do that. I don't think the political parties can do that, or the mainstream, the old ones. They're stuck and aren't going to get over it. But we totally take inspiration from that and think about how we can train each other and support each other in developing that kind of thing. But I want to take I am taking too long, but I want to get to your prior question, because I think that's absolutely central. I don't think that the left in this country, and by this country right now I mean England, can get anywhere without having some answer to the English question. And of course the English question is multiple questions. How does England have political representation? Wales has it, Scotland doesn't, England doesn't. How does it have cultural representation? At one level it does, we can all see that. Yeah, but for a lot of people they don't. There's the confusion between England and Britain, at least people feeling that something is not being articulated in the UK context. And we can't just dismiss it. But you started by talking about pride in place. That I like, people like Derbyshire or they like whatever. And I think it's a very interesting question to ask why. Why is it we're okay with that? And because I get it, and we're not okay with the English thing. What's the move? What's going on there? Yeah, because England is a place. Yeah. So I think it is, and I think maybe the answer is partly precisely articulating an Englishness around that sense of place and locality. That what the Americans are quite good at is celebrating their diversity, ironically, given how they are. From California to New York, from the bayou to the mountains, the snowy wastes and whatever, yeah, and celebrating the different cultures at their best. At its best, that's what America does. And I do wonder if there is a capacity to develop a language about that for England, for the left. That it's about people doing their own thing in different places, not doing what London says. That's part of it, and having their different languages, dialects, cultures, cuisines, attitudes, outlooks, and turning that into a form of celebration, and going back at the Farages, because the irony is that the nationalist parties, talk about talking the country down, right? They hate it. They seem to hate everything about England. And a little bit of my pride stirs. I don't live in London. I'm not a Londoner. And in many respects, I dislike London. But when I see those audit videos of, London has fallen, I'm like, no, it's not. London, it's my capital, right? And if we can kind of find a way to articulate that, I don't think that should be impossible. Maybe we get over certain kind of squeamishness. But I think we can do that in a way that doesn't buy into racism or kind of an empty pride, but it's precisely about liking it's about turning it from the abstraction of nation to the actual things. I actually like the south coast. I like going to Yorkshire and being in that part of the countryside. I like being in Manchester. It's super fun, and turning that into. So that was my kind of rather rounded ownership, which means I'm not going to get around to say a lot about your question about ownership, but it's exactly the right question, and there is a politics to be built around the fact that, which maybe even does connect to the kind of question about national culture in some way, which is that we absolutely, in that sense, we absolutely have allowed our culture to be taken over by foreign interests that don't want to represent and express the experience of being from Manchester or living in the Dales or wanting to go walking in the hills in Shropshire.
I have to say, this audience is very generous with the clapping. I feel like I love it. Every time there's a panel speaking, it's like, yes, thank you for your thoughts. So I feel the same. But with that, I want to be mindful of time. We are going to wrap up. So if we can just give one more big thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you all for joining us. Sign up for our mailing list. You can hear more about some of the great upcoming events we have. We'll be in touch soon with what we've got coming down the pipe. So have a great night. Thanks so much.